The Russian military using conscripts to fight the war in Ukraine. This is a topic that I want to discuss before anything significant happens on the field of battle. I'm going to be upfront about this. Yes, there is about a 50-50 chance that sooner or later Russia is going to conscript some people and send them to Ukraine. This is a topic that many people in the Runet are talking about, because the simple fact is that Ukraine is a country of about 30-35 million people. In terms of territory, it is the second largest country in Europe. It is the largest country after Russia. So holding all of this land is a job that requires a lot of manpower. The Russians only have about 200,000 soldiers in Ukraine. And the common argument is that 200,000 soldiers cannot realistically hold a rear this large while still dedicating enough forces to the front lines to keep advancing. And in my opinion, this is indeed a compelling argument. Keep in mind that we're not talking about the battlefield of Ukraine as it is today. We are talking about the battlefield as it might look like 3, 4, 5 months from now, when Russian forces are occupying half of Ukrainian territory and some forces have to advance towards the other half. At that point, Russia is almost certainly going to need a lot more than 200,000 soldiers. Russia can, of course, deploy some more contractors than it already has, but it can only deploy so many without drawing upon troops that are protecting the rest of Russia's borders, without drawing upon the garrison in Kaliningrad, which hosts about 100,000 soldiers, and without drawing upon the personnel that are deployed in other countries in foreign military bases, in Syria, in the Caucasus, and in Central Asia. One has to remember that the number of contractors within the Russian military is only about 600,000. Of these, a significant portion are Navy personnel, Aerospace Forces personnel, and Strategic Missile Forces personnel, i.e. not people who you would expect to hold the rear in captured territories in Ukraine. Of course, Russia can hope to draw upon some of the resources of the two Donetsk republics, who have already committed to mass mobilization, but even so, they have less than 100,000 soldiers combined. And we are talking about a lot less than 100,000, more like 50,000 or so. So I want to make this perfectly clear. There is about a 50-50% chance that Russia might indeed start conscripting people to fight the war in Ukraine. And I guarantee you that if this does happen, Western media is going to jump on the hype train. They are going to start reciting all of these stories about enormous Russian losses. They're going to start claiming that conscription is a direct result of that, and that soon Russian conscripts are going to get massacred in Ukraine, yada yada, blah blah blah. So the reason I'm making this video is to say ahead of time, no, if this does happen, it's not going to be because Russia lost a lot of people in Ukraine. It's going to be because it never had enough to begin with. So don't be surprised if Russia announces some form of civilian mobilization in the future. Now, in terms of conscription, there are two things that I want to mention. The first is that conscription does not mean that everybody, every kid, every grandpa on the street is going to be handed a rifle and is going to be sent to the front lines. It is possible to conduct limited mobilization targeting individuals who already have some form of military experience, even if said experience is just going through the regular army training that most Russian men go through when they are conscripted. In my opinion, this is what will most likely happen before this war is over. Implementing such a policy will allow the Russian forces to raise an army of, I'm not going to start guessing numbers, but of a lot more soldiers than what they currently have. And to add to this point, I will mention that Russia has already enacted one specific type of military mobilization. Russia has, as of only a few weeks ago, begun accepting volunteers into its armed forces to fight in Ukraine. This was not something that was around on day one of the war. This was only implemented towards the very end of March. Of course, moving from volunteers to conscripts is going to be a whole other level of mobilization. But I will say this, such a move is likely not going to be unpopular in Russia. What Western media pretty much universally underestimates is how much support there is in Russia for this war. And that is largely because Ukraine is historically Russian land. And I'm not just talking about the Kievan Rus, which happened over 1,000 years ago. Ukraine was a part of Russia throughout the Russian Empire, throughout the Soviet Union, and as a direct result, there are many cultural and even familial links between everyday Russians and everyday Ukrainians. So, Ukraine isn't some sort of strange and faraway country to Russians. And this is what all of the people who talk about small countries defeating large countries in war fail to understand. These people often cite America's war in Vietnam, the Soviet Union's war in Afghanistan, America's war in Afghanistan, etc. However, the problem with this argument is that a country like Vietnam or Afghanistan is a faraway, distant place to your average American. It's not something that a lot of Americans, or a lot of Russians for that matter, would be willing to fight and die over. But Ukraine is not like that. Ukraine is much more closely linked to Russia, and this link goes both ways. That is to say, Ukraine is linked to Russia and Russia is linked to Ukraine. Due to all of these historical reasons, Ukraine is essentially a part of Greater Russia, and this isn't just Russian propaganda, by the way. This is a position that many Ukrainians also agree with, especially if we're talking about eastern and southern Ukraine. Now, to have this part of Greater Russia be run by a Banderite regime, which hates, absolutely despises everything Russian, which spits on the sacrifices and losses of the Soviet Union, of the Red Army in the Second World War, a war that was a war of survival to the Russian people. To have Ukraine be run by a Banderite regime, which is bending over backwards for the United States and the collective West at every single step, and is practically offering these countries to place its nukes that would target Russia, on Russia's own borders. All of that is absolutely unthinkable to your average Russian. And that is why everyday Russian people understand perfectly well that this is a war for the long-term survival of Russia. This is a war to overthrow the Banderite regime in Ukraine, which came to power in 2014 as the direct result of a Western-initiated and Western-backed coup. And as an example that people in the West can hopefully relate to, I want to mention a hypothetical situation of what might happen in the United States, which is similar to what happened with Ukraine and Russia. So imagine for a second that, let's say for example, the collective East, Russia, China, a bunch of other countries, were to initiate a coup in Canada. It would be a violent coup that would bring a nationalist regime into power. And then imagine that you would have the systemic persecution of English-speaking people in Canada. Let's imagine for a second that the nationalist regime that comes to power is a French nationalist regime. This regime then launches a bloody war against the province of Ontario, which is arguably the most culturally and economically aligned with the United States. And then suddenly there is talk of Canada developing its own nuclear weapons and joining the Collective Security Treaty Organization to allow Russian forces and Chinese forces to deploy onto Canadian territory. And of course, all of these soldiers would be positioned near the United States border. They would almost certainly be involved in direct fighting against any breakaway Canadian states or unrecognized breakaway pro-American country that might exist in Ontario, and they would have all of the necessary logistics and weaponry to launch an attack against vital areas of the United States at any time that they please. Do you think for a second that the United States would tolerate that? Of course it wouldn't. Just like Russia didn't tolerate what is happening in Ukraine. And I guarantee you, At that point, the appetite for war in the United States would be through the roof. People would be calling for a nuclear carpet bombing if that is what it took to remove a foreign-backed regime in their neighboring country. Now, thankfully, nobody is calling for a nuclear carpet bombing in Ukraine yet. But in Russia, the support for the military operation is through the roof. It is well over 80, perhaps even over 90%. So for that reason, I can guarantee you that the population in Russia would not be opposed to a limited mobilization. And to add to this point, I will mention that these soldiers who are mobilized, who are conscripted, are most likely not going to be fighting on the front lines. Russia already has enough contractors for that. The manpower that Russia needs is to hold and secure the rear, to hold various captured Ukrainian towns, villages, cities, to ensure that there are no acts of terrorism or sabotage in these areas, and that local governors or authorities cannot take power into their own hands, thereby creating anarchical states behind the front lines of the Russians. So Russia needs to hold the rear, and there is a good chance that it will have to rely on conscripted manpower to do this. The good news for all of these potential conscripts is that holding the rear is not nearly as demanding and doesn't entail anything like the same combat risks as fighting on the front lines does. It doesn't require aircraft, cruise missiles, ballistic missiles. It doesn't require all of this heavy fighting equipment. It doesn't require tanks, or at least not nearly in the same quantities that fighting on the front lines does. For the most part, all that it requires is raw manpower. And that is why something like this would be an ideal job for an organization such as the Russian National Guard, which, by the way, is already in Ukraine. However, it's very likely that this National Guard would need to have its ranks expanded to more effectively hold the rear once Russia starts securing more territory in Ukraine. A few final points that I would like to make. The first point is that I often see people talking about Russia taking some parts of Ukraine and then just ending the war. For example, Russia taking all of Ukraine east of the Dnieper River, as well as some of southern Ukraine, and then just saying, that's it, we're not going to advance any further, the war is over. And frankly, I don't think that that is going to happen. The vast majority of people in Russia also don't think that this is going to happen. The mood currently is that the Russian military must go all the way to the western borders of Ukraine and ensure that the regime which came to power after 2014 no longer controls even an acre of land. And the main reason why people think like this is because they realize, they understand perfectly well that the backers of the Ukrainian government in the European Union, in the United States, in NATO, aren't going to allow Ukraine to capitulate no matter what. If Russia stops at the Dnieper, if Russia stops in taking southern Ukraine, then it's just going to have a long border with an implacably hostile regime, which is still at war with Russia and will continue launching attacks and artillery strikes into Russia at every possible step. Therefore, many people see the only option as being to advance to the western borders of Ukraine and to ensure that the current Ukrainian regime completely ceases to exist and becomes a thing of history. And if Russia manages to achieve this military objective without ever having to implement some form of conscription, then that is going to be just a tremendous military triumph for Russia. It is going to be the strategic equivalent of a chef's kiss. So it's not completely impossible that Russia might achieve all of these goals without ever implementing any form of conscription, but I wouldn't bet on it. The task ahead of the Russian military is enormous, and it's not just enormous in the fact that it requires a lot of hardware. It is also enormous in the sense that it requires a lot of manpower to achieve. And for this reason, I think that there is a high probability that sooner or later Russia is going to have to implement some form of conscription to achieve all of its objectives. And once again, the utter sewage dump that is Western media will at that point start hyping up all of the claims of enormous Russian losses and will start claiming that Russia is losing the war. And if such a thing ever does happen, I'm going to refer people to this video to explain exactly what is going on. If, on the other hand, nothing of the sort does happen, then you can just forget about everything that I've said. Everything that I've said in this video will be irrelevant. Anyways, once again, I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please be sure to leave a like, subscribe to the channel. It helps the algorithm, especially on YouTube. And also, if you are watching this on YouTube, please be sure to check out my other channels. Please check out my Rumble channel and my Telegram channel. The links to both will be in the video description. And if you're already watching my video on Rumble, then the links in the video description will be to my YouTube and my Telegram channel respectively. Please be sure to check those out as well. Once again, I hope that you enjoyed. Thank you for listening and have a wonderful day.